I'm really happy to bring you this. It's a little bite-sized chunk of a process. And so what we're focusing on in this particular video is using watercolors. But it's not like a normal watercolor tutorial video. We're not going to teach you how to paint a landscape or a house or a portrait. This is just about for us beginners and also those of us who just want to have a way to re-tap back into that act of working with watercolors in an automatic way, in a mindful way. The thicker the paper that you have access to, the more water you'll be able to put onto it without it really buckling and distorting and the watercolor paint getting kind of grimy. So yeah, you'll need watercolors. If you have colored inks, that also works. Again, this is about automatic processes, trying to get into a flow state, trying to get into a state of really engaging with the materials and the sense of wonder as we watch the paints merge around and play together. Remember, this is about flow, it's about experience.
All right, so I've got my setup, some paper down. I got some butcher's paper to make sure that if I make a mess, it won't go everywhere. Some jars of water on the side for rinsing out my brushes and my paints. Here's my paper I'll be using. It's Strathmore Bristol, so you don't need to use this. It's, for me, like a nice paper because I can also go over the watercolor paint with technical pens and ink. Here's my brushes that I'll be using. So I've got one, these are both sable hair brushes. One's from a school that I did remotely, so the Joe Kubert School, a famous comic artist, and the other one's just a normal sable hair brush. Again, you can use whatever, it doesn't really matter too much. With watercolors, I find it can be easy to get carried away with too much water at first. So I'm just starting pretty small. As long as it's not too hot, your paint shouldn't dry too quickly. But I'm trying to avoid putting down too much water in the beginning and just starting small. And what I'm doing here is it's sort of like automatic drawing but with paint. So I'm not trying to paint a particular thing. I'm just putting the paint down and just starting with one color to begin with. Refamiliarizing myself with how it works. Essentially what I'm doing is just putting it down and then finding some nice patterns and finding a variety between heavy paint application and a lighter paint application. So the different consistencies of water to paint, putting it down, and then just watching how they run together. So I've kept going with this process, building it up a little more, just slowly. And what I do now is I've got the paintbrush in my left hand just has water in it. So I'm just creating little water trails on the paper, and then I'll add watercolor paint to that. So it doesn't really take any special coordination, but it just means that I can have, like a brush that's loaded with paint in one hand and then one that's just water in the other, and then I can have a bit more flexibility in how I I work with the paint. I've dipped the paintbrush into the green color, and now I'll start adding that to the mix. So blue and green are next to each other on the color wheel, and so they won't clash. So I can start putting this down together, and avoid any concern about it becoming a big mess too quickly. For me, I find it better to just really take my time in building up colors. But what's happening here, this is the part that I really love, is watching, like mixing colors together. What I'm doing here is really like mindful painting. I'm not concerned about having a particular outcome. I don't really care too much how it ends up looking. It's about trying to enjoy the moment to moment experience of what I'm doing. I've actually done this similar kind of painting before, and I don't know why. For me, I find myself just making these connections between different strands and little centers. Kind of ends up looking like an artist's impression of a brain or something, with all of these neurons uh, reaching out and connecting. So this is after some time. You can see that the paint has dried. When it dries, it sort of becomes a little bit lighter, which is always can be a bit tricky with watercolors. They look darker when they're wet. But now I've decided to use a complement to the blues and greens. So I've mixed up a mix of yellow and orange, and now I'm just sort of deliberating where I'll start adding it and how. So I'm using first a brush just with water, putting it down on the paper, and this is a different way to just going straight in with the paint. So you can see the watercolor just finds this pool of water and then dissolves into it. And I find it so therapeutic just watching these colors mix together and do their thing on the paper. So now I'm just going to add a little bit of reds to the yellow and orange color. Not too much. I'm trying to keep, a balance still. I'm trying to keep, it's almost like when I do this kind of activity, I feel like I'm training myself to see what looks good. so that when I'm maybe trying to make a colored piece of artwork, hopefully some of that sticks in my head so I can have an intuitive sense of like what's a good mix of colors. It's one thing to know about rules of color harmonies and color schemes and color psychology and whatever, but it's, I feel, also important to have like an intuitive sense about what just looks good to you, to you personally and subjectively. And that's what I'm thinking is being trained here. So we're moving along. I've added, a fair bit of red to those colors, but I feel like it's working pretty well. Let's not become too overwhelming. Now I'm starting to think about this this sort of piece of paper as something that has like depth to it. So what's underneath, that this thing is not just flat, but it's sort of like a three-dimensional series of connections that I'm looking down and into. So I'm starting to think about what's underneath, what's on top, what's overlapping, and start thinking about creating form. And again, like this is sort of training my brain for depth and spatial relationships. I feel like I've done enough with the yellows and oranges. I've allowed it to dry so you can see, or you might be able to see that it looks a little different in some places where it's dried. And now I'm like, what's going to be a nice complement to feel this out a little more? So I'm going with like a really diluted green, like an aqua color. I'm cautious to stay within the color spectrum that I've already sort of established. So, I could be a little bold and add purples or, like start going in with the ink pen, but I feel like this color here will just sort of help to tie everything together. So what I'm doing here is I've got one brush which I'm using to apply the aqua, like the diluted aqua colors into the spots, into the white areas. And then I'm using the other brush which has some like dark blue ink, or not ink, dark blue watercolor on the brush tip. And I'm just like touching that into the wet spots to create these little extra areas of contrast. So this is sort of like an automatic exercise for myself. I'm creating the rules as I go along. The rule now is that I'm filling up these white areas with the aqua color and adding like a spot of dark blue to each of those areas. And it's like this consistent series of steps that I can create for myself. And so that just means that I don't have to think about what am I doing next. I'm focused on the activity, but I'm not thinking. I'm just consciously aware of what I'm doing. So it's like meditation. I'm like opening myself to being in the flow state. So just turn the paper as you need to, give yourself good access. Although I'm not doing this to make a beautiful thing, yeah, sometimes it can end up looking quite nice. So it's, yeah, not the reason I'm doing this, but it can be a secondary outcome. If it doesn't end up looking beautiful, that's also fine. Usually I'll learn a lot from the creation of something that's ugly, sort of objectively ugly, as to, more so than what I'll learn if I create something that's sort of a little bit more nice to look at. Adding like a bit more, like a darker green to these aqua spots. Still staying within the sort of established color spectrum that I've already set myself. This is part of, again, what I'm just sort of trying to train myself as to what looks good, what balance of colors looks good, what plays well together, as well as training my hands to use the brush, and my awareness of what the paper can do and can hold, and my courage and confidence with using the paints and the colors. Just adding in the last bits of color, create a bit of a border for this, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful for you. And with colors, this is just one way to do things. But I think for a lot of people, that might find stepping into do landscape painting or something a little bit intimidating. This might be useful. What I'm doing here right now, hopefully, can open you up to a lot more sense of experimentation and play with watercolors. So that just like lowers that fear factor and makes you more able to just paint things from memory, from imagination, or from observation with a lot more freedom. So that just bravery for experimentation, a bit more openness for play, a bit more openness to just give things a go, and be willing to take risks, and not worry too much if things don't work. the entire process took probably about an hour and a half. You know, what else could I do in that time? Watch a movie, you know, do some exercise, whatever. But doing this, I felt very refreshed at the end of it, and it was very good as well because I hadn't used watercolors for a while actually. So it always is good to sort of dip the toes back in and refamiliarize myself with it. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, and that's the more or less finished piece. Cheers, guys. Take care. Bye.